Hello and welcome to the Mobile Accessible Games interview series. Mobile Accessible Games is a brand that's focused about all things about mobile accessible gaming, and through our interview series, we interview game developers as well as accessibility influencers about the state of accessible gaming. And this week we have a game developer. His name is Paul Wang. He is the creator of a trilogy of games called Sabres of Infinity, Guns of Infinity, and the upcoming Lords of Infinity. And he's going to be talking to us about his games as well as accessibility. So, Paul, welcome.
Hello, I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. So, Paul, I always like to kind of start off the interview with just you giving a brief bio about yourself so we can have everybody know a little bit about you before we get into the formal questions.
Okay, so long story short, I was born in Jinan, which is the provincial capital of Shandong province in northeastern China.
Okay.
I lived there until I was 4. My dad moved to the United States for work. We moved around a bit, and we ended up in Greater Vancouver sometime when I was around 13, 14, and I've lived here ever since. So
So, are you a Canadian resident?
I'm a Canadian citizen. I
Canadian
have been
citizen.
for a while.
Excellent. How do you like Canada?
I like it a lot more than well, I'm not sure how critical I can be of the country I was born in, but I like it a lot more than the old country.
So, does it go like Canada first, United States second, China third? Is that how you would
Uh,
rank them?
Probably.
Not. Where in the
Um,
United States were you from 4 to 13?
not all the way to 13. I lived in upstate New York for about 3 or 4 years, and then
Okay.
we moved to Ontario, then
Oh,
Montreal, and then over here.
I gotcha.
So I've moved around quite a bit.
Gotcha. Well, that's good to see different parts of the world. It's good exposure. So we're here to talk about a trilogy of games that you have created. Two of them are out,
Oh,
Sabres of Infinity and Guns of Infinity, and coming out expected on March 2nd of 2023 will be the release of the third installment called Lords of Infinity. So why don't we just start off a little bit of you telling people what are these trilogy of games about?
so this entire series, which I've more or less provisionally titled the Dragoon Saga. It's planned to be 5 installments in total, of which Lords of Infinity is sort of the hinge on which the rest of the series rests on. You are a member of the minor nobility and a junior army officer in the unified kingdom of Tierra, which is a third-rate power in a gunpowder fantasy setting. So it's got magic, but magic kind of takes a back seat like to gunpowder warfare. So muskets, cannons, ships of the line, stuff like that.
Right.
So I guess one way to put it is it's got a lot of aesthetic from what you'd expect from, say, the Napoleonic Wars or Regency romances, but at the same time, there's also an undercurrent of, I guess, low fantasy there because obviously the world isn't ours, and there is a system of magic. There are certain fantasy conventions which you might expect, like for example, there are religious orders of knighthood, and they go into battle wearing enchanted plate armor and carrying like flaming longswords, but they're extremely rare and they're becoming sort of an anachronism. The, all of these fantasy conventions kind of have they're subverted or they're deconstructed or they're sort of twisted in their own way. Like you've got, for example, you've got elves who have the expected sort of elven arrogance and hauteur, but that's also backed by the fact that they are like in control of one of the great imperial powers of the setting, so they can back up all of that arrogance with firepower and numbers and technology and all sorts of.
I mean, even to the point where the kind of war and battle that you're mixed up in as the protagonist of the story, they just think it's kind of like a minor footnote and don't even really care about.
Oh,
They're just,
absolutely, yeah. One of the main themes of this series is that while most while a lot of fantasy kind of takes place in what's sort of seen as the center of the setting, Like I know a lot of especially Anglo-American fantasy is set in a quote unquote good kingdom, which is
Mhm.
sort of like the place where institutions are the most enlightened or the most advanced, or at least like I guess I suppose you could say the most liberal. Um, and it's necessarily like an important part of the setting and the scene as such, and people see it as like the center of civilization, or at least the center of a continent's civilization or something. I wanted to write a story about sort of people on the geopolitical fringes and how they deal with the machinations and the politicking of the people who exist in the imperial core.
Who
So
could basically run, ram shot right over them if they really wanted to,
yeah, like I said, Tierra is a third-rate power.
Right.
You're like at the beginning of the series, like Tierra has been sucked into a war with the League of Antar, which is a much larger and considered a much greater power, and everyone expects Tierra to lose because their army is considered kind of a bad joke, and that's where you start off the story as a junior officer in the sort of least respected part of the government of a third-rate power, and a lot of that story through the course of the war, which takes place through Sabres Infinity and then Guns Infinity, is dealing with sort of the expectations which that leads to, in the sense of how the underdog, I guess, fights against an enemy with greater numbers, and how they have to exploit sort of the societal weaknesses of a more powerful country to actually eke out a win. And now with Lords of Infinity, which is the war is over, the player character, the main character, goes back home where he inherits a noble estate and he inherits an enormous family debt, and basically a lot of that is about how dysfunctional Tierran society is, and in a way why it is a third rate power, because not only is not only are like Tierran economic and political interests beholden to like these other imperial powers out there, but they're also sort of in their own dysfunctional and deeply unequal and unjust society, which is kept together mostly because those in power have an interest in keeping that sort of society because it keeps their freedoms and their power and their style of life even at the expense of everyone else.
Now, the interesting thing too about this story, which as everyone listening here, I mean, it's very rich, very deep, and we'll get into even some more of the supporting background that's available. But you, as the game player, you have some agency in this world because this is kind of a choice script, text, and choose your own kind of text adventure concept. So you start out at Sabres of Infinity, and you get to mold a little bit of what happens in the world and what happens with your character, and carry that over to Guns, and then carry that over to Lords, and I assume to the next ones as
Yes.
well. So again, you have such a rich world, and maybe I'll mention this part. You also have kind of a website where you do a lot of writing about the backstory of the world that these various games take place in, and there's a really interesting part I want to talk about that. But from creating it where the player, can kind of change some stuff up, how difficult was that? From you have a story you want to tell, but you also have to allow the player to kind of maybe change that story on you a little bit from maybe what you first envisioned.
Originally, like years and years ago, I started working on the setting back when I was in high school. I thought of it more as a more of a linear storyline, but there's also the fact that when I did start on this, it started off as a forum roleplay because that's basically how I learned to write. I moved around a lot, so I didn't have a lot of friends outside the internet. So in a lot of cases, I joined a lot of online communities, and I found out that I really liked telling stories. So I ended up joining forum roleplays, and like the writers in forum roleplays can be really, really tough with criticism, but it is I found it an extremely effective crucible for honing my writing style. And this whole setting started with a forum role play I set up in high school. And so it was originally sort of a collaborative work where other people could still have input in where they wanted the story to go. So, in that respect, I suppose, since I only had a general idea of how I wanted things to progress, I had an advantage there. But when I was considering how I wanted the series to play out and how I wanted the player to make the choices they did, I feel like I've tried to constrain them in certain ways, which makes them, I guess, which cuts off some of the branches which would lead to basically me having to write entirely different games.
Yeah, I feel like what I saw a lot was you have a scenario, and based off of different choices, you can solve that scenario based off of, some other decision that you may have made, a
Mhm.
concentration on a stat, or something that, relationship that you built with somebody, that now you cash in that chip here to solve this problem, and kind of understanding what you've done in the past and how that might play a factor into, solving the current
Absolutely.
scenario. It was quite interesting. And then, if you know choose wrong, and don't leverage that stat you built up, then you might fail that mission, or you might die, or battle might not go your way. So that was kind of interesting. There was always something that you've picked in the past that kind of plays out later in the story. There's kind of no dead end decision, I guess I would say, from what I saw.
I feel like that's part of my kind of evolution as a narrative designer because when I wrote Sabres on Infinity, I was very much focused on the idea of trying to balance around the basic stats that you get at character generation. And one of my friends basically told me the first time he play tested it, I can autopilot through the whole game just by picking whatever option tests my highest stat. And that's something that stuck with me as a criticism because since then I've tried to sort of not only make the options test other things like the relationships you've built with other characters, the previous decisions you've made, the sort of mindset which you've given your character's internal monologue. But I've also tried to make decisions which don't really have what might be considered an objective right answer, where it's the decision is more moral than mechanical, where maybe if you have taken a certain side or you have certain friends who've among the non-player characters who framed a decision a certain way, you'll see it a certain way. Or maybe if you've leaned into the assumptions and the prejudices of the player character's class, because the player character is still a member of the aristocracy. They are complicit in all of these injustices that hold Tierran society together, and at the same time, they are under massive pressure to conform to that because um, if they don't, then a lot of those options get cut off because a lot of those options, especially in Lords of Infinity, where the player is back in like the midst of tier and high society, a lot of that's based on your reputation with your own class, and a lot of that's based on the favors that you can cash in. And those favors and those resources aren't available if everyone with power sees you as a pariah because you don't fulfill those expectations and you don't submit to those pressures.
I kind of alluded to this before, but you have a website that, I think it's every month you write, I'm going to guess it's 3 to 5 pages about the world. And um, my favorite part, from what I read so far, is, in, I can't remember if it's at the end of Sabres, or in the middle of Guns. You partake in an enormous battle that kind of goes awry, and you write probably about 10 months worth, 5 pages. So I'm going to guess it's 50 pages, 30 to 50 pages on kind of an analysis of why that battle went wrong. Like someone who's doing an audit of that battle, and
Mhm.
here's what happened, historically with, the losses we have, and how we've replenished our troops, and how our training was, and the lack of leadership that we lost in earlier battles, and it's just kind of really played out the world as opposed to being a kind of a flat. Here's what happened in this battle. It didn't go my way. You can, with that background that you're reading from the website, it really kind of shows you. Oh, now I kind of understand why. This world. Things that happened in this world kind of played into our falter and our arrogance in losing that battle or having that battle not really turn out exactly how we hoped.
So this whole all of the world building articles I put on my website are funded by Patreon. So if you support me on Patreon, you get those articles a week early, and at certain support tiers, you get to vote on like what articles I do next, and also potentially suggest like what articles can be up for voting. So, and I've been doing that since Guns and Vanity came out, which was something like 6 years ago. So I've got a lot of that kind of put together. But in particular, the Wells report, which is what you were mentioning about that big sort of novella-sized analysis of the big defeat, which happens at the end of Sabres and Infinity. I guess I would. That's part of kind of my academic background because I've got a degree in history, and when I was a kid, I boys who read a lot are generally like pushed towards having interest in certain subjects, right? Like like military history is one of them because battles are exciting. When you're a child,
Right.
it's explosions and it's explosions and sword fights and gunfights and artillery duels, and there's a lot of spectacle behind that. And I feel like where I diverged was instead of just sort of going in on the spectacle of battles and weapons and great commanders and all that, I kept asking why. Like, why was this fight lost? Why did they win this fight? Why did they lose this fight? And so on. And that kind of ended up, I guess, feeding my belief that in a way military history is the everything history, because to learn why a side won or lost a battle, you sort of have to go beyond weapons and commanders, because ultimately an army is a representative of the society that fields it. And that means that everything about that society, whether it's how they organize their labor, how they treat people who they consider to be the most vulnerable, how they distribute wealth, what their religion is if they have one, all of these things kind of wrap together into the forces that decide whether an army wins or loses or a fleet wins or loses. And I feel like a lot of that plays into how this series, which basically started as straight military fiction, ended up um, encompassing so much world building outside of that. Of course, that was part of the plan all along because this series is vaguely planned. I've got a vague idea of how I want to end the fifth book. Um, and in a lot of ways, the first two, Sabres Infinity and Guns Infinity, are the prologue to the main story that carries the rest of the series. So, yeah,
When you, so we're specifically talking about this battle, but um, did you write this battle first, not knowing any of, kind of why that battle was lost, and like you said, then start asking questions why to kind of backfill it in, or did you kind of already have an inkling of why this went wrong, and then just fleshed it out a little later after Guns Infinity came out?
I mean, I generally like these were questions I was asking long before I started writing the series, but
Okay.
this was generally speaking a pretty long time ago. I wrote Sabres Infinity in 2012, 2013. But I knew how Sabres Infinity was going to end because that was one thing I wanted to make kind of hammer home that you have agency and you have the ability to change certain things, but you're still one person in a very large world, and there's only so much power one person can have, no matter how well they do or how exceptional they are. And that's and of course the other thing I wanted to hammer home was the fact that it doesn't matter how heroic you are, how prepared you think you are, war will mean losing,
Right.
even if which is again a theme which I sort of explored in Guns Infinity and again Lords Infinity, which is that even when you win a war or win a battle, you will still lose something. You will still lose friends or limbs or your own life or like any manner of, because that's ultimately what war is. It's loss. It's when people make the decision to go to war, it's they're ultimately making a gamble that they won't be unlucky enough to be basically plucked out of existence in the hope of that they might win some prize all the way from like all the way to the very top, and the people who like decide to make that decision to go to war in the first place, because nobody actually wants to go to war. Everyone wants peace, but everyone wants a peace which is subjectively good for them.
Right.
And if they think that that peace is like that favorable peace is worth the cost of getting other people killed or themselves killed, that's when they go to war.
The other thing I thought was really interesting between sabers and then lords, or sorry, guns. I mean, so sabers at the end, we're talking about this big battle, and you can kind of play some different roles in that battle, or have some different outcomes within that battle. When you go to guns, guns ends on a big event. I'm not going to give too much away because I want people to play it, but um, and there's kind of different parts of that event, and you might play so how do I describe this? If at the end of Sabres, you have event A and you're just kind of a subsegment of event A, in Guns, there's event A and event B and event C, and you play a role in one of those, and the other ones kind of happen off screen, if you
Mm-hmm.
will. So it kind of gives some nice replayability, because you might want to go out and be like, well, what if I don't take part in this part of the event? I did B. Let me see if I go and do A, and how can I affect the outcome of the end of the story by just playing a completely different role. So I thought that was kind of a really interesting, and made it feel like my story could be really different from your story if you went and played one part, and I went in a completely different, on the other side of the country doing something completely different.
Mm-hmm. Well, the one thing I wanted to do to kind of make up for the fact that your character is sort of constrained by societal expectations, and in the first two at least, by military discipline, is I wanted to make sure that the personal choices that you could make did have consequences that reverberated across the whole series. So, um, if you make a certain decision at the end of Sabres, that's going to give you entirely different options through Guns and Interlords. And again, if based on those decisions that you made uh, at the end of Sabres, you made certain other decisions at the end of Guns Infinity, you will have entirely different options available or not available to you throughout Lords of Infinity as well. Where one thing I try to do a lot is I try to have the story acknowledge the choices which the players previously made, not just because I want choices to have consequences, even at the very most trivial level, but because I want the world I want to have like the world continue to give like these consequences to the player, just to remind them that like you made this decision all these years back, and you didn't know how it was going to play out, and sometimes these choices have unexpected consequences.
And
And
not immediate
yeah,
consequences either.
like everyone thinks they're making the right decision when they make that decision, and it's only when we have hindsight or or like a more distant perspective can we decide, hey, maybe this was the wrong thing to do, maybe this would have been better, or in the end it worked out, just not for you.
Right. Yeah, I think it was on Guns. I don't know how many times, maybe that's third or fourth time I played through because for reviewing it, I want to play it, try to see everything. I don't think it was to the third or fourth time I played through where I got where, oh, I don't even have to, partake in this major event. There's a whole other, mission that I didn't even know was available that I ran into the third or fourth time I played, and was really kind of blown away by that. That I was opening up stuff that I wasn't really expecting to see much different on that third or fourth playthrough. So that was really exciting when I ran into that.
I generally try to reward players who sort of choose an option for the hell of it, who like go in thinking, like, I think as a game developer and as a narrative designer, one of the most rewarding pieces of feedback I can get is from somebody who goes, wait, you can't actually do that, can you? No, you can actually do that. That's just an amazing feeling because it means like I have been able to anticipate somebody else's, basically their wildest dreams in that particular circumstance, and been able to deliver on that. And that's always nice.
I really appreciate a developer who has kind of a branching story situation such as this, where you know there's a whole section that you've written that maybe has like a 10% chance that somebody might choose the right options and hit it to open up that particular branch. And I really kind of appreciate that you went through all of that effort for something that maybe 10% of the people will actually end up seeing. That's kind of an exciting thing, and to be a person who got to see it is also really exciting.
I think I think there is sort of a I guess a I guess a misunderstanding about like side routes like that, because if it's not so much that 10% of players will see it, it's that 10% of players will see it on their first playthrough, which means, especially now, since players obviously communicate with each other like through word of mouth online, etc., they say something like, well, I made this choice and this happened. And one of their friends goes, well, I made this choice and something entirely different happened. And that'll be something that encourages them to play again. And maybe this time they will see more of that material and more of it. And
Do you
one of,
do you get to see stats on that? Like, can you see how many, on average, how many times people have played through the game?
I do not. I just have a lot of friends who apparently like my work. So I get a lot of feedback from them too. Um,
What made you come up with this world? Like, what was the spark that this was the story that you thought about telling?
Honestly, back when I was in high school, I wanted to tell. I read a lot of fantasy, but I also read a lot of military fiction, especially military science fiction. And it was sort of a combination of those two interests where I felt like I could tell a fantasy story, but if I told it my way, it would be a lot more grounded in what I considered to be a historical reality at the time. That's changed quite a bit because I've grown as a person and my views have changed. I'd like to think I've become a much better person than I was when I was 15, and I've sort of altered what my creative vision has been to match that. But um,
So you've been writing this for, I mean, are you 10 years in? Is that right?
more or less, when I started university, I okay, so since I was a kid, I've always wanted to do game development, right? Since I puttered around with like Game Maker when I was 12, and I basically spent all of my high school years sort of thinking of writing as this fun hobby that I could do, and game development, like traditional game development, as what I wanted my career to be. And when I started as an undergrad, I started working on Flash games. I made a game called Master of Fortresses with a collaborator, and I did that for a couple of years. And I kind of came to the realization that I like making games, but I like making games as a means to tell stories.
Okay.
So ultimately, I focused on the idea of picking a platform, in this case, interactive fiction, where I could tell stories through games as opposed to making games which incidentally told stories.
And this is built on choice script, right?
Yes, yes, it is.
And is that what you started with, like when you started Sabres, or when
Yep.
you started, that's what you started with, right?
It was, yes, but I was sort of completely figuring things out myself. I didn't understand any of the best practices because I have almost no formal computer science training. I took a comp sci course at like a 100 level comp sci course as an undergrad, and I failed the first time. So I am not good with computers, as they say. But I eventually figured out how the scripting system worked, and I still don't think I'm all that great at it, but I can do what I want to do, and that's the important thing.
How do you keep all the branching storylines, organized?
Well, when I started Sabres, I had no notes. I didn't keep any notes on anything. It was all in my head. When I started Guns, I plotted everything on a single sketch pad like piece of paper. And when I started Lords, I filled out like half a notebook. So as things have gone on, I've had to become more elaborate in my planning, but the real thing that keeps me consistent is the fact that I've got a fan base and they are more than willing to act as like volunteer beta readers because I have a relatively open development process. Generally speaking, when I have one or two chapters done, I will post that development build up and take feedback into account and sort of work from there until basically the point where I'm almost done, and then I take it down for copy editing and all that. But one of honestly the biggest advantages I have is I have a really committed ride or die fan base who will really get into the weeds of both the script and the prose and tell me when I've got something like I've got an inconsistency or when an option should be there or shouldn't be there, or to pick out bugs and stuff like that. It, it takes, I guess, quite a bit of time interacting with them, but I feel like it's mostly worth it most of the time.
Um, so Sabres, you're writing 10 years ago or so. Are you still getting downloads every month on it, or
I
are you
am.
finding new people?
I am, and one of my hopes is that when Lords Infinity comes out, people will be interested in the rest of the series as well, because again, they can always start from the beginning of Sabres and follow their character through like essentially 12 in-game years of setting and world building where they get to shape the character that they start Lords with at like in like a really intimate scale.
Right. Um, so you kind of said you've informally trained yourself, how to do, the choice script, computer programming, um, and you kind of have, a degree in history. What's your day job?
This is my day job.
This is your day
I
job. Oh, great.
I
That's
write for a
awesome.
living. I mean, writing isn't really a particularly well-paying job, but I honestly enjoy it. And at this point, I'm not sure I could get myself to do anything that isn't like writing for interactive fiction or doing narrative design at this point.
Oh, well, I am so happy for you because there's so many people who, you know, don't have enough of a fan base and this is their side gig or what they do at night. If you're able to support yourself doing this full time, I mean,
Honestly,
I'm so happy for you.
I was profoundly lucky. Um, my parents scrimped and saved for my university education basically since I was born. So I had I and of course I live in Canada, so tuition's a bit lower than it would be in the States.
Sure.
Um, I started I started I did Flash development as an undergrad. I made some money from that. And I was able to keep that money instead of spending it on like living expenses because my parents paid my tuition, they paid my rent for those years, and I was able to spend my last 2 years as an undergrad writing Sabres Infinity and then other stuff, making enough money to not only pay off what student loans I did have, but also to give me enough of a start living after university. So
So tell people, besides going to the app stores and downloading, Sabers and Guns and marking your calendar for March 2nd for when Lords comes out. You mentioned you got a Patreon. I mean, can you tell people a little bit more about that and where they can go to support you?
So yes, I do have a Patreon. It's mostly so I can to support my writing on top of not just what I write for my day job, but also for 3 monthly columns, which I have, which are A Soldier's Guide to the Infinite Sea, which is the one that covers uh, the setting of the Dragoon Saga, Sabres, Guns, Lords, and Vanity. There's also my other series, the Fledgling Realms series, which starts with the hero of Kendrickstone, which also has its own column, The Adventurer's Guide to the Fledgling Realms, and I have a third column about writing and world building as a craft and my creative processes. And
That middle one that you were just talking about is that a an app store game as well?
it is a Choice of Games mainline series. So instead of going through their hosted games imprint, it's published directly through Choice of Games. It's more of a conventional sort of power fantasy slash high fantasy story where you start off as sort of this you start off as this young person who wants to be an adventurer, and it's a lot more you go out into the wide world, you find adventure, maybe you find riches or glory, and a lot there's a lot fewer strings attached. Personally, I refer to I refer to the Dragoon Saga as my Afflict the Comfortable series, and the Fledgling Realms as my Comfort the Afflicted series, because they've got vastly different tones, I
Right.
suppose.
What so I know that's what the name of the series is, but what, like, if I was going out on the app store, what am I searching for to find, that game?
Um, to find, well, you'd be looking for the Hero of Kendrickstone, which is the first one, and then the Crypt Keepers of Hallowford, which is the second one.
Okay. So
And
and two of those are out
two
right
so
now.
far,
And
yes.
when's the third one on that one expected to hit?
I don't know. I haven't started working on it yet.
Okay. All right. So we can get four of your games right now with a fifth shortly
Well,
on its way.
no, there's more on top of that too. There's also a standalone game which I made back in 2014 called Mecha Ace, which is another interactive fiction game set in a science fantasy, a mecha setting. Like
Okay.
think Mobile Suit Gundam,
Right.
Macross, BattleTech, stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And it is again, it's got a very military science fiction flavor to it, because like I guess that's my personal brand now. But it's a standalone. It takes a lot of inspiration from the mecha anime and the giant robot fiction of the 80s and 90s. Um, it paid for my student loans, so
Nice.
I and I a lot of people like it. There's also um I did a spin-off for one of Choice of Games' first games, Choice of Broadsides. I did a sequel for that. I guess a spin-off for that called Choice of Broadsides HMS Foraker, which is free. Where like in Broadsides, you play as the captain of a sailing vessel in a world which isn't quite our own during the not quite Napoleonic Wars.
Gotcha. So on all of these, like if I go to the app store and I go, more games by Paul Wang, I will find all of these.
Yes,
Nice. Uh,
and
well, here you go. I just kind of want to remind people. I mean, you're making a living doing this, which a lot of people aren't. So you must be doing something right. Which, again, I knew the caliber of your Sabers and Guns games, which I have played. If those are any indication of the quality of the other games that you have out there, I'm excited to run out and download all of these right now.
I'm also working as one of the writers along with Alan Keyes, who wrote Tin Star and Marine Raider. I am the second writer on Burden of Command, which is a tactical RPG, which is coming out sometime probably in the next year or two but that's going to be entirely on Steam for PC. So,
And it's actually funny that you mentioned Marine Raider because that I just starting that. I just started it this morning as one of the games that I'm playing to review.
mhm. um, Yeah, Al, Alan's a great writer. He's great to work with. I feel like he writes 5 words for each word I'm able to get out. So but I have the last laugh because he wrote Tin Star, which currently holds the record for I think the largest game in the Choice of Games and Hosted Games catalog, but at like 1.3 million words, which is a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But Lords of Infinity is 1.6.
That's a lot too. I mean, to give people, so I wrote a book, it's 350,000 words, which was about 420 pages, just to give people a frame of reference of what 1.6 million is. Uh, that's like 5 novels.
Of course, they won't see all of it in one playthrough, which is kind of
Right.
the point, I think. I want basically to have entire novels lying under the surface that players won't even be able to see unless they start digging, which should encourage them to start digging, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Paul, again, I have played your first 2 games. I am very excited about Lords. I would love to have you back when that's about to come out so we can get some more information about it. For those who have listened to this, again, really interesting background that you've given us on the game. Go check out Paul's Patreon page. Again, he has a lot of content that he's putting out there. Again, I can speak to the quality of that as that Wells report was really, really interesting about the battle that you face at the end of Sabres. And check out his other games. I am literally going to go right as we hang up here and go out to the App Store and download your other games, which I didn't even think to do when I played these 2. So that's I'm glad you told me about the other games that you have out there. So you'll see some more sales by the end of the today. So
Awesome.
yeah, excellent. So again, please come back. Any kind of last closing words that you want to share with the community. Again, for everybody here, again, people who follow me, we're really about mobile accessible gaming. So we have a very big blind and visually impaired community. These games are all, or at least most of these games are on ChoiceScript, which is a fully accessible voiceover platform. So most of those games that he mentioned, other than that, maybe Steam one, is fully accessible and should cause you no issue of getting to play them. I played both Sabres and Guns, and the voiceover was flawless, just as it is with all the ChoiceScript games.
Um, I'm gonna, I guess, have a bit of a personal confession here. I'm mostly able. I had Bell's palsy when I was an undergrad, so like half of
That's
my face
that's
is
yeah, that's the
yeah is
paralyzation of the
very
face.
very marginally paralyzed. Like
Yep.
my right eye isn't as strong as my left eye anymore, and my nose runs when I eat. So it's not a major issue. So I never really gave all that much thought to disability accessibility um until I started dating and married somebody with chronic pain and early onset arthritis, and until I started making friends with like people who had chronic pain and like Ehlers-Danlos and sort of all of these things which I was taught never to really consider. And it was only in retrospect that I figured out how much effort Choice of Games put into making these games accessible for not just people like me, but for everyone. And um, honestly, as I came to that realization, I was kind of really proud that I made that choice to stick with them
Yeah.
throughout my writing career.
Yeah, no, it is great. There's lots of really great and interesting stories on that ChoiceScript platform, and gives an instant catalog that the blind and visually impaired community can go and access. Same with me. I mean, I don't know how much I paid attention to it until I lost my sight 3 years ago, and suddenly kind of got thrown into this world. And it kind of makes you aware of all the things that aren't accessible and that could be accessible, which can be very frustrating, and just how much the simplest of things that a sighted person can get done, just takes you 3 times as long as a blind person. So, that's why I really kind of started the group that I started, because I wanted to, you know, show and point to, here's fun things that you can do. These are a bunch of accessible games or across a wide variety of genres, and you know, hundreds of different stories that are being told that you can play and enjoy and have an experience that is, fun and enjoyable, even though you're faced with, the challenge of being blind or visually impaired. So, that's the kind of whole purpose and mission of the group that I started. So, Paul, again, thank you so much, and we look forward to, seeing you again, hopefully in March.
It was great for talking with you.
All right, thank you so much.